How far would you go to win a game? For a group of friends, that question would lead to an unimaginable tragedy. What began as a harmless game of truth or dare quickly spiraled out of control, revealing hidden resentments and unleashing a series of events that would end in violence. The summer of 2019 had been a whirlwind for these five friends. Between finishing college, navigating new relationships, and dealing with the daily grind, they were all in need of a break. Mason Harper, the group's de facto leader, had proposed a weekend getaway to the cabin his grandfather had left him. The cabin, tucked away in the woods and isolated from the bustling town, had always been a place of refuge and nostalgia for Mason. It was the perfect escape from the pressures of their everyday lives. Mason had inherited the cabin earlier that year, and it had quickly become a symbol of a simpler, more carefree time. He eagerly invited his closest friends to join him for a weekend of relaxation and fun. The group consisted of Mason's girlfriend, Lily Adams, who was as excited about the trip as Mason was, Jake Miller, Mason's best friend known for his wild sense of humor, Jake's girlfriend, Sophia Gray, who had a penchant for adventure, and Owen Blackwell, a quieter, more introspective member of the group, who had recently been feeling disconnected from the others. The decision to head to the cabin was made on a whim, driven by a collective desire to unwind and reconnect. The group had spent weeks planning the trip, discussing everything from the food they would bring to the activities they would do. The cabin was stocked with supplies, and the excitement was palpable as they made their way to the secluded retreat. The drive to the cabin was filled with laughter and anticipation. The friends reminisced about their shared experiences and joked about what the weekend might bring. Upon arrival, the cabin revealed itself as a charming, rustic hideaway, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature. It was the perfect backdrop for their long-awaited escape. As the sun began to set on the first evening, the group settled in and started enjoying their time together. They cooked a hearty dinner, played music, and shared stories. The night seemed to stretch on forever, filled with the warmth of friendship and the comfort of being far from the stresses of everyday life. It was during this idyllic setting that someone suggested playing a game of truth or dare. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and the group eagerly gathered around. What began as a fun, lighthearted game quickly started to take on a different tone as the evening progressed. The game started innocently enough. After a few beers and harmless dares, Jake was the first to act. He dared Sophia to perform a ridiculous dance routine in the middle of the living room, which she carried out with exaggerated enthusiasm. The room erupted in laughter, and the mood remained light, with everyone enjoying the playful banter and camaraderie. But as the night wore on and the alcohol flowed, the dares began to take on a more provocative edge. Owen, quietly nursing his drink in the corner, became the next target. With a mischievous glint in his eye, Jake dared Owen to kiss Lily, Mason's girlfriend. The dare was met with gasps of surprise. Owen's face reddened with a mix of embarrassment and anger. He had always felt somewhat like an outsider in the group, and the dare felt like a personal attack. Mason's eyes narrowed, clearly displeased with the direction the game was taking. However, Owen, unable to refuse the dare without drawing more attention to himself, reluctantly leaned in and gave Lily a brief, awkward kiss on the lips. It was more of a peck than a passionate embrace, but it was enough to create a noticeable shift in the room's dynamic. The group's laughter was uneven, and the lighthearted mood had begun to sour. Mason's jaw clenched as he shot Owen a look that made it clear he was not pleased. Lily, visibly uncomfortable, tried to defuse the situation with a quick smile, but the damage had been done. Although the group attempted to move past it, the tension lingered like a heavy fog. As the game continued, the dares became more intense. It was clear they were pushing the limits of what was acceptable, and the mood shifted from playful to confrontational. The next dare came from Mason himself, who, in an attempt to assert his dominance and regain control of the game, dared Owen to retrieve a small sheriff's badge from a display in the cabin. The badge, a relic from Mason's grandfather, a former sheriff of the town, had been carefully preserved on a shelf in the living room. At first, the dare seemed harmless, but it quickly became apparent that Owen was uncomfortable. He had always been uneasy around the cabin's decor, and the badge held particular significance due to its sentimental value. Owen hesitated, his face reflecting a mix of reluctance and unease. Mason's patience wore thin as he pressed Owen to complete the dare. Mason's tone was dismissive, and his gaze was locked on Owen with barely contained frustration. Owen's discomfort deepened. The group fell silent, the tension in the room thickening. Sensing the growing hostility, Sophia tried to interject, but Mason was insistent, more focused on asserting his authority than keeping the game fun. Owen looked around at the others, searching for support, but found none. The group's eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to act. With a heavy sigh, he stood up and made his way to the display where the badge was kept. The room watched in tense silence as he reached for it, his hands shaking slightly. Carefully, he removed the badge from its place, holding it up as though it were a fragile relic. The room was eerily quiet, with only the distant crackling of the fireplace breaking the silence. Owen's face was a mask of concentration and anxiety as he made his way back to the group, the badge clutched tightly in his hand. When he returned, the mood in the room was far from celebratory. Mason's expression had softened slightly, but the underlying tension remained. Owen placed the badge on the coffee table with a sense of relief, but the damage had already been done. The game had taken on a darker tone, and the camaraderie that had once defined the evening was now overshadowed by an uncomfortable silence. The group tried to move on, but the atmosphere was charged. The playful nature of the game had been replaced by an undercurrent of resentment and frustration. Owen, feeling more isolated than ever, retreated to the edge of the group, his demeanor reflecting the strain of the night. As the evening dragged on, it became clear that the game had revealed more than just secrets and dares. It had exposed the fragile boundaries between friendship and animosity. The tension that had been building all night was about to reach its breaking point. Owen, feeling the weight of the evening's events, withdrew further into himself. The earlier discomfort of the badge dare had left him vulnerable and exposed. He sat quietly on the edge of the circle, his eyes darting between his friends, who seemed more interested in continuing the game than addressing the growing unease. In an attempt to lighten the mood, Sophia dared Jake to call an ex from his college days and leave a silly voicemail. Always up for a challenge, Jake took the dare in stride and made the call. The group watched in amusement as Jake left an exaggerated, over-the-top message which briefly had everyone laughing. But the laughter was short-lived, and the unease that had settled over them was not easily dispelled. It was Mason's turn, and he seemed determined to regain control of the evening. He dared Lily to perform a bold and somewhat risky stunt, to step out onto the cabin's small balcony and shout a funny phrase into the night air. Lily hesitated, unsure, but Mason's insistence and the pressure of the game pushed her to accept. As Lily stepped onto the balcony, the cool, crisp night air enveloped her. She stood there for a few moments before breaking the silence with the phrase Mason had dared her to shout. Her voice, amplified by the stillness of the night, echoed through the surrounding forest. When she returned inside, her face was flushed with both embarrassment and a sense of relief. The game continued, but the dares had taken on a more dangerous tone. Jake dared Sophia to drink a concoction of questionable ingredients he had mixed as a joke. With her usual adventurous spirit, Sophia downed the drink with a grimace, eliciting nervous laughter from the group. Though the tension lifted momentarily, the unresolved issues hung in the air like a storm cloud. Then it was Owen's turn again, and this dare would prove to be the breaking point. In a moment of ill-conceived humor, Jake dared Owen to go into the nearby woods and retrieve a mystical artifact he had hidden earlier as part of a prank. The artifact was nothing more than a cheap Halloween skull, but given the night's escalating tension, the dare took on a far more sinister edge. Owen's face paled as the group laughed and encouraged him to take on the challenge. He knew it was meant as a joke, but the thought of wandering alone in the dark woods with his nerves already frayed was overwhelming. Slowly, he stood up, the room watching with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Grabbing a flashlight from the corner, he headed for the door. The group's laughter and cheers echoed behind him as the door closed with a heavy thud, leaving him alone in the night. Outside, the darkness of the woods seemed to swallow him. The flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, revealing twisted branches and dense undergrowth. His footsteps were the only sound as he ventured deeper, the light dancing nervously across the forest floor. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sent his heart racing. As Owen ventured deeper, his thoughts raced. He was keenly aware of the isolation, and the sense of dread growing inside him was unbearable. The dare which had seemed foolish inside the cabin, now felt malicious. His breath came in ragged gasps as he neared the spot where Jake had hidden the fake skull. There it was, lying among the leaves, its hollow eyes staring up at him. He picked it up with trembling hands, feeling both relieved and deeply unsettled. It was nothing more than a cheap prop, yet the experience had taken a toll on him. Clutching the skull tightly, Owen turned and began his walk back, quickening his pace as distant noises echoed through the woods. When Owen finally returned, the mood in the cabin had shifted yet again. The group, now half drunk and tired, sat in a state of restless anticipation. His arrival was met with a mix of awkward silence and half-hearted cheers. He placed the fake skull on the coffee table, his hands still trembling. Mason, clearly irritated by how long Owen had been gone, made a sarcastic comment, Owen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. After Owen reluctantly completed the dare and returned, the mood in the cabin soured significantly. The earlier playfulness had evaporated, replaced by an undercurrent of palpable tension. The group, visibly shaken by the night's events, decided to take a break, hoping to cool off and regain some semblance of normalcy. As the group dispersed, Mason's frustration reached a boiling point. The earlier kiss between Owen and Lily had struck a nerve, and Mason's anger was exacerbated by a mix of humiliation and intoxication. He watched as Owen sat alone on the cabin's porch, his posture slumped and his expression distant. Seizing the opportunity, Mason stormed outside, his steps heavy with purpose. Lily called after him, but her voice was swallowed by the night's growing darkness. Mason ignored her, his focus solely on Owen. He approached with a menacing intensity, his eyes narrowed with anger. Owen looked up, his face a mix of exhaustion and defiance. Mason's anger flared. "You think you can come into my space and mess with my life?" The confrontation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged with increasing ferocity, Mason's frustration boiling over. His voice was a low growl as he continued to berate Owen, their faces inches apart, the argument growing more intense. Suddenly, Mason's anger took a violent turn. In a fit of rage, he stormed over to the outdoor barbecue set where a knife lay on the table. Without hesitation, he grabbed the knife and turned back to Owen, his eyes wild and unfocused. Before Owen could react, Mason lunged forward. The knife glinted in the moonlight as it sliced through the air, finding its mark in Owen's chest. The shock of the attack was immediate and overwhelming. Owen's eyes widened in pain and disbelief as he staggered backward, his hand clutching at the wound. The sudden violence caught everyone off guard. Hearing the commotion, the group rushed outside to find Mason standing over Owen, the knife still clutched in his hand. Horror spread across their faces as they took in the scene. Sophia, her face pale with shock, knelt beside Owen and tried to stop the bleeding, her hands trembling as she applied pressure to the wound. "Someone call for help! We need an ambulance!" she shouted, her voice breaking with panic. Despite Sophia's frantic efforts, it became clear that Owen was critically injured. Blood flowed steadily from the wound, and Owen's breathing was ragged and shallow. In his final moments, his gaze met Mason's, a mix of anger and sadness reflected in his eyes. The weight of Mason's actions began to settle in, but it was too late to undo the damage. The crushing realization of what he had done hit Mason with an overwhelming force, but it did nothing to change the tragic outcome. As Owen's breathing grew more labored and his strength waned, the cabin, a place once filled with laughter and camaraderie, had transformed into a scene of horror and tragedy. As Owen's life slipped away, the group was left grappling with the aftermath of the night's violent climax. The atmosphere in the cabin turned somber and reflective. The friends, reeling from the shock, struggled to process the enormity of what had occurred. Owen's death created a void that seemed impossible to fill, and the consequences of Mason's actions were profound and irreversible. The arrival of the police marked a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Mason was taken into custody, his face a mask of numbness, as he was led away. The gravity of his actions was evident, yet the full reality of his crime was too overwhelming to grasp immediately. Sophia, Lily, and Jake were left to deal with the fallout. They gathered in the cabin's living room, their faces etched with grief and confusion. The once close-knit group had been shattered, and the bonds of friendship that had seemed so strong were now marred by tragedy and loss. As they sat in stunned silence, the reality of the night's events sank in. The cabin, with its serene surroundings and nostalgic charm, had been transformed into a site of intense conflict and violence. What had begun as a game of truth or dare had exposed deep-seated issues and culminated in an unimaginable tragedy. The friends were left to reflect on the fragile nature of their relationships and the consequences of pushing boundaries too far. The memory of Owen's final moments, along with the haunting reality of Mason's actions, would linger with them for years to come. In the aftermath of the stabbing, Mason Harper faced a high-profile trial that captured public attention. Charged with the murder of Owen Blackwell, Mason's trial became a complex and emotional affair, unfolding in the local courthouse. The prosecution depicted Mason as a man consumed by jealousy and anger, framing the fatal stabbing as a premeditated act triggered by a heated confrontation. They highlighted testimonies from Lily Adams and Sophia Gray, who described the rising tension during the Truth or Dare game and Mason's subsequent outburst. The prosecution argued that Mason's actions were reckless and a direct result of his inability to control his emotions and alcohol consumption. In contrast, Mason's defense team, led by an experienced attorney, argued that the stabbing was an impulsive reaction rather than a planned act of murder. They contended that Mason was not in a sound state of mind and acted out of sudden, overwhelming anger. The defense sought to portray Mason as someone overwhelmed by personal issues and intense emotions, emphasizing that the attack was a momentary lapse rather than a calculated crime. After several weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Mason guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict reflected the conclusion that, while the crime was not premeditated, Mason's actions demonstrated extreme recklessness and a disregard for human life. The judge sentenced Mason to 25 years in prison, acknowledging both the gravity of the offense and the emotional turmoil that contributed to his actions. The trial's outcome offered a degree of closure for Owen's family and friends, yet the emotional impact of the tragedy continued to deeply affect the community.